Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku, and today I'm continuing with some readings that I'm getting from my own research, researching African-centered curriculum, and in continuing with these readings as episodics. Today we're going to be reading a paper from PHILIP HIGGS called Towards an Indigenous African Educational Discourse, a Philosophical Reflection. Before I begin though, in the very soon near future, I'm going to reveal a bit of the curriculum. And I'm going to show you one of the instructables that I've come up with that you'll be able to replicate everything at home, and it'll kind of give you an idea of the direction that the curriculum is going. So look out for that in the next few weeks, before the end of the year for sure. I'll have that for you, okay? So, in continuing with these readings that looks at African-centered education, I'm going to read this paper today with some commentary. The abstract reads, The liberation of Africa and its peoples from centuries of racially discriminatory colonial rule and domination has far-reaching implications for educational thought and practice. The transformation of educational discourse in Africa requires a philosophical framework that respects diversity, acknowledges lived experience, and challenges the hegemony of Western forms of universal knowledge. In this article, the author argues that indigenous knowledge, as a system of African knowledge, can provide a useful philosophical framework for the construction of empowering knowledge that will enable communities in Africa to participate in their own educational development. As I posted earlier today on Twitter, I posted this quote by Patrice Lumumba. Africa is one, but Africa is not for everyone. Africa belongs to Africans. And that's an important quote because we need to understand that Africa is not foreign to us. We are Africans, and we play a role in Africa's development, in Africa's quote-unquote creation, as Africa's creators. And Africa's creation. So we need to fundamentally understand that when we talk about Africa, we're not just talking about the landmass, but we're talking about its people, which includes those of us outside of Africa. So paper starts with this section called African History and the Colonial Influence. Much of the history of Africa has been dominated by colonial occupation. Colonialism in Africa provided the framework for the organized subjugation of the cultural, scientific, and economic life of many of the African continent. This subjugation ignored indigenous knowledge systems and impacted on African people's way of seeing and acting in the world. In fact, African identity, to all intents and purposes, became an inverted mirror of Western Eurocentric identity. This state of affairs gave birth to numerous attempts to reassert distinctively African ways of thinking and of relating to the world. Such attempts find expression in that spoken tradition and body of literature referred to as African philosophy. In this paper, the writer attempts to contextualize the problem of an African educational discourse in the call for an African Renaissance. By an African educational discourse, I mean those forms of teaching and learning which are inclusive of African philosophy, African lived experiences, and the teaching and learning which uphold this philosophy. I then go on to discuss what I argue are the main tenets of African philosophy and the consequences that these might have for African educational theory and practice. So the next section is the African Renaissance and educational discourse. The call for an African Renaissance has been present in the period marking the nearly 4 decades of African post-independence. The process of decolonization that unfolded during this period saw Africa assert its right to define itself within its own African context in the attainment of independence. Thiago, 1993, claims that independence was about people's struggle to claim their own space and their right to name the world for themselves rather than be named through the color-tinted glass of the Europeans. In the context of education, Hopper's 2001 describes this continuing struggle in the following way. The African voice in education at the end of the 20th century is the voice of the radical witness of the pain and inhumanity of history, the arrogance of modernization, and the conspiracy of silence in academic disciplines towards what is organic and alive in Africa. It is the voice of wounded healers struggling against many odds to remember the past, engage with the present, and determine a future built on new foundations. It invokes the democratic ideal of the right of all to be, to exist, to grow and live without coercion, and from that to find a point of convergence with the numerous others. It exposes the established hegemony of Western thought and beseeches it to feel a measure of shame and vulgarity at espousing modes of development that build on the silencing of all other views and perceptions of reality. It also seeks to make a contribution to the momentum for a return of humanism to the center of the educational agenda, and dares educators to see the African child learner not as a bundle of Pavlovian reflexes, but as human being culturally and cosmologically located in authentic value systems. Not as a bundle of Pavlovian reflexes. And that's the thing, like, you know, Eurasians see the world, see people as animals in a sense, right? Things that you control and you study them to understand what they respond to. And we need to shun all of that stuff. What is meant by the African Renaissance in educational discourse is therefore founded on the perception that the overall character of much of educational theory and practice in Africa is overwhelmingly either European or Eurocentric. In other words, it is argued by advocates of an African Renaissance in educational discourse, such as Tefo in 2000, or Vilakazi in 2000, and Siepe in 2001, that much of what is taken for education in Africa is in fact not African, but rather a reflection of Europe in Africa. And you see, this is why we have so much work to do, right? Because the danger, like even in the curriculum building that I'm often talking about on this show, the danger is that because we, you know, most of us listening to this program, because we are products or byproducts of being in America, in and around the U.S., within U.S. influence. We have to be careful that the curriculum that we build, even though it's Afrocentric in its creation, or in the thinking that goes into it, but we also have to be very careful that it's also not a reflection of Europe and Africa. And that's why, you need to have checks and balances to ensure that, we are on the right course. This is why you also need to have the continent involved in anything you do, to make sure that you are on the right course, you're not clashing with culture. The African Renaissance has also, hold on a second, the African Renaissance has also taken on a much greater significance in recent days with the call for the recognition of indigenous knowledge systems by scholars such as Hoppers and Siepe. The inference here is the distorted view that Africans possess little or no indigenous knowledge of value that can be utilized in the process of educational transformation. This same inference also presupposes, it is argued by protagonists of an African Renaissance in educational discourse, that the norm for educational achievement and success for African children and students is that of Western European capitalist elitist culture, where the English language is sacralized and the internalization of bourgeoisie European values is seen as the index of progress. And that is something that is very true of Africans in America and the Caribbean, and seemingly there's truth to this on the continent as well, because of the forced proximity that we've had with these people. Our yardstick, the way we measure ourselves, it has European measurements on these yardsticks, and that's something we're gonna have to really break. We're gonna have to really break away from and really go back to who we were. Lisa T is in the chat. Lisa T says it's very true on the continent. Yeah, so we've really gotta be mindful of how we go about. This is why we need intellectuals, those people who are learned, knowledgeable, those people who are able. We need them. We need all of these type of people to come together. There's no time for entertainers anymore. And I've talked about that a lot in the past. To continue. Lisa T says, you see it with a lot of Nigerians with money. Yeah. As a matter of fact, aren't the Nigerians right now in Nigeria rallying behind Trump? Which just absolutely makes no sense. Make it make sense. But to continue. And it is in response to this state of affairs that the call for an African Renaissance in educational discourse goes out. A call which insists that all critical and transformative educators in Africa embrace an indigenous African worldview and root their nation's educational paradigms in an indigenous sociocultural and epistemological framework. This implies that all educational curricula in Africa should have Africa as their focus and as a result be indigenous grounded and oriented, which is one of the aims of the work that I've been doing. Failure to do so, it is argued, will mean that education becomes alien, oppressive, and irrelevant, and that's the problem. Right now, because, like in America here, because our children are going to these Eurasian schools where the curriculum is based around, obviously, Eurasian folks, right, and their histories and their science and their economics, etc. We have a case of our children not only being miseducated, but being funneled because of the miseducation, because of their disinterest in the education. They're being funneled into this school to prison pipeline. I've talked about that. Look up the episode I did some time ago with Jason Edgar talking about the school to prison pipeline. That's because the reason why they're not engaging in school is because of the school is not tapping into anything relevant to their own culture, to their own existence, right? Will mean that education becomes alien, oppressive, and irrelevant, as is seen to be the case with the legacy of colonial and neo-colonial education systems in Africa. The call for an African Renaissance in educational discourse therefore seeks to demonstrate how indigenous African philosophies can be tapped as a foundational resource for the socio-educational transformation of the African continent, and also how indigenous philosophies can be politically and economically liberating. This means that by virtue of assuming the indigeneity of culture, the call for an African Renaissance in educational discourse does not connote a detachment from political radicalization and mobilization. In short, it would claim that the influence of Western, Eurocentric culture on Africans needs to be forcefully arrested by all critically conscious African educators in the struggle for the establishment of an African identity in educational discourse. Yeah, you got to throw all that shit away. You know, that's essentially what that's saying. Throw it away. It's nothing. It has no value to you, you know? And you could see that again based on what Lisa T says in the chat room. Yeah, she said, yep, very disturbing. Talking about these Nigerians out here protesting for Trump. You can guess what kind of education they've had, what kind of socialization they've had. And it's not indigenous African. I now turn my attention to the contribution made by African philosophy to the establishment of such an African identity, and explore the possible framework that African philosophy can provide for the construction of empowering knowledge that will enable communities in Africa to participate in their own educational development. So the thing I always say, and this is to each their own, different people have different philosophies, that's fine. My thinking is that the end goal for Africans in time is to return to the continent. I understand, though, that you're not getting folks like recently we've seen the ADOS and the FBA folks in America. You're not getting those folks who relish in the claim of, you know, having a direct lineage to an ancestor on a plantation in America. You're not getting those folks anytime soon to go back to Africa, and they don't have the knowledge of self to return. You're not going to the Bahamas or Dominica or Trinidad and getting folks to just up and return. We have Rastafarians who've been talking about repatriation for the longest, and they're still in those islands, right? So, and the reason is because it's a process. It's an education. You gotta start to instill the ideas of Africa into people. You gotta open them up to realize that there's a place for you to go. There's a lot of possibilities, upward movement that you can make, etc. If you learn how to solve problems wherever you are, then you could take that skill back to Africa and you have something to give to the continent. Like I always say, Africa awaits its creators and its creations, right? So my thing is, between now and that time when we, tip the table, which could be 100 years from now, 200 years from now, before we really get people, we need to start educating youth now and hope that it becomes a part of culture. Hope that it's transferred down the line, down lineage, and eventually our people will be so filled with knowledge of self, they'll make that trod back. And for those who are not making the trod, we still want to say that everything is going to be all right once everyone goes to Africa, and to forget our people outside. That's not a good direction to me either. What we want to do is have a strong African nation, right? So that even if you're outside of Africa, you're protected by the strength of Africa. Right now, Americans pretty much can go anywhere in the world and do all sorts of, all kind of bullshit out here in the world. And they have a whole government that'll back them up. They have a government that'll come knocking, talking to other governments to get their people out of captivity. When those Olympic men from the swimming team for America went down, I think it was Brazil or something like that. When they went down there and did some nonsense down there, they were able to get up out of there because they were American. If that was some, I hate to say it, but if that was some Caribbean or African nation, some representatives of those places who went down there, the places where we're from don't have the power, don't have the strength to really come and protect their people. And that's what we need to work on. So we need to work on a stronger Africa. We need to take our time and take the right steps towards educating the youth who will become the adults and the decision makers in the community in the future, right? We need to take those steps now so that in some future time, we'll have more people who are thinking about going back to Africa and helping to keep or make and sustain Africa as a strong nation, right? African philosophy and the problem of an African identity. The question of an indigenous African knowledge system, that is, of an African philosophy with a distinctive African epistemic identity, is not unproblematic. In the light of Africa's colonial legacy, African philosophy is confronted with the problem of establishing its own unique African order of knowledge. The attempt to establish a distinctively African epistemic identity within the discipline of philosophy has brought into question what it means to be an African and what it means to be a philosopher. Oh yes, Athrazer, the brethren, I posted his YouTube channel link earlier on my Twitter. Head to my Twitter and check it out. He's in the chat room. He says, I don't know how I didn't realize that this was your focus. We need to talk offline. I know Athrazer is also a educator, right? And I'm pretty sure, based on his music, he's an Afrocentric educator as well. Lisa T, she made a distinction. When I talk about these Americans and how they can go anywhere, yes, I'm talking about white Americans in particular, right? By the way, to you guys in the chat room, to you guys listening, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. Let's continue, shall we? The question of what meaning we attach to the adjective African when we talk about African philosophy is a crucial debate in attempts at establishing a uniquely African order of knowledge. Some African philosophers, for example, Mudimbi in 1988 and Hun Tonji 1983, 1985, regard an intellectual product as African simply because it is produced or promoted by Africans. They therefore adopt a geographical criterion in their definition of the term African in African philosophy, in that they regard African philosophy as the contributions of Africans practicing philosophy within the defined framework of the discipline and its historical traditions. So, personally, I think that, and then this is why you got to think in a Pan-Africanist way, right? So they're talking about like continental Africans, all right? That's what I gather. And the truth is, we need to think, all of us, in and outside of the continent, we need to think about all Africans and what all Africans worldwide have to offer to the continent. We shouldn't overlook people outside of the continent. But then another criterion, referred to as the cultural criterion, is also used to determine what is meant by African in African philosophy. According to this criterion, a philosophical work is African if it directs its attention to issues concerning the theoretical or conceptual underpinnings of African culture. Such a view is clearly presented by Gaike, 1984, when he writes, philosophy is a cultural phenomenon in that philosophical thought is grounded in cultural experience. According to this view, then, the study of the traditional African world in terms of views, ideas, and conceptions represents the unique substance of African philosophy and legitimizes references to what is referred to as African philosophy. With regard to the term philosophy, two conceptions of philosophy have become prominent in debates about the idea of African philosophy. First is the definition of philosophy as a rational, critical activity. Those who adopt this definition of philosophy, for example, Appiah, Aruku, and Bodunrin, Oladipo, Wairedu, and Huntonji, frown at the attempt to equate African philosophy with traditional African worldviews. In doing so, they make a distinction between philosophy in the popular sense and philosophy in the academic sense. In the first instance, philosophy is regarded as being concerned with traditional African worldviews, whereas in an academic sense, philosophy is a theoretical discipline, like, for example, physics, algebra, and linguistics, with its own distinctive problems and methods. Scholars in Africa who view philosophy in this academic sense are referred to as universalist African philosophers because they emphasize reason as a universal human phenomenon. To you guys listening, you could type it in the chat room, you could type it in the comments below. Yeah, Afrazer is a high school geometry teacher. Yeah, we need folks like you involved in this curriculum. Yeah, in the comment section, what do you feel African philosophy really means? What does it mean to you? There are, however, other African philosophers such as Anyanwu, Gaeke, Mabogo, Machega, Mbiti, Kafagawana, and Kwame, who maintain that traditional African worldviews constitute an authentic African philosophy. They insist on a definition of philosophy that is broad enough to accommodate these worldviews. Recourse to traditional African worldviews is taken up in the practice of what is called ethno-philosophy. The two conceptions of philosophy that have become prominent in debates about the idea of African philosophy are thus marked by those who insist on a strict definition of philosophy, on a purity of form. They are out to defend the professional integrity of their discipline against the popularization by cultural nationalists. And those who give a rather broad definition of philosophy and emphasize the specificity of the content of whatever is produced by African philosophers in the practice of ethno-philosophy. See, I think all of this is just kind of nonsense, personally. But again, you guys, let me know what you think in the comment section, in the chat room. What do you think about, what do you consider African philosophy? And what do you think about just debating about what African philosophy is? However, the concern with definitions, be they definitions of African or philosophy, is considered by some, for example, Oladipo and Appiah, to be misguided and distracting. I agree 100%. It's just time wasting, right? How come I can't see my mouse? Oladipo in 92 argues that there are no definitions that capture the essence of either of the terms African or philosophy. No one definition can be credited with a universal application because both these terms are linked with a social history that impacts upon their meaning. In responding to the preoccupation with definition, Appiah, 82, points out that there are other issues for philosophers in Africa to explore now, which require not preliminary anxieties as to whether our work fits existing labels, but confident examinations of some of the questions for which our training happens to have equipped us. And I could get behind that one. Let's get to the work. Let's stop dealing with the definitions, especially when some of these definitions themselves are based on like a European framework. In the light of these remarks, it would seem that the problem surrounding African philosophy is not the problem of anything meeting the criteria for being both African and philosophical. Rather, it is the problem of the extent to which African philosophers have been able to put their intellect in the service of the struggle and destiny of Africans. In other words, the issue is not that of whether a contributor to a debate is African-born or whether the question under consideration is authentically African in the cultural sense. It is not even the issue of whether what they are doing is pure philosophy, applied philosophy, ethno-philosophy, social criticism, or whatever. Rather, it is, in the words of Oladipo, it is the issue of the extent to which African philosophers have been able to use whatever intellectual skills they possess to illuminate the various dimensions of the African predicament. And to me, that's really what it comes down to, right? Forget about what box you fit in, right? And all this kind of stuff. Let's get to the business. Let's get to the work. In the chat room, Arthur says, and I agree, preoccupation with definitions do not serve us. They don't. Not when there's work to be done. Let's get to the work. Oh boy. And that's the problem with Africans. We spend too much time as African people bickering and trying to see who has the better definition and trying to define this and that. Let's just get to the work. It's enough of that already, right? This sentiment is taken up in part by African scholars such as Sarah Quebrahan, 1994, who adopt a hermeneutical perspective on African philosophy. Rooting themselves in what is traditional to Africa, these scholars seek to escape an enslavement to the past by using the past to open up the future. They contend that philosophy, properly construed, must move beyond a preoccupation with universalist abstractions and ethnological considerations and call into question the real relations of power in Africa. In this regard, and this is a difficult name for me, Serekwebahan states that the discourse of African philosophy is indirectly and historically linked to the demise of European hegemony, colonialism and neo-colonialism, and is aimed at completing this demise. It is a reflective and critical effort to rethink the indigenized African situation beyond the confines of Eurocentric concepts and categories, right? Get to the work. The work is we're trying to break down this hegemonic hold that these Eurasians have on us, right? Let's just get to the work. To appreciate the distinctive features of African philosophy, it is also helpful to compare its method and execution with other systems of philosophy. Appiah elucidates the difference between African and Western philosophy, being mindful of the condescending attitude of the West towards Africa. For Appiah, the West considers the issue of what philosophy is for. That is, its social meaning and relevance with intellectual and academic contempt. Undoubtedly, the West does philosophize in a different style and method from Africa, although this may be attributed to enormous resources and funding. That's an interesting thought, right? Philosophy being based on resources and fund, like, you know, having resources and having funding is shapes one's philosophy, right? The West is concerned with perfecting philosophical discourse for its own sake, while Africa wants to use philosophy in a particular sense to address social issues, including the nature of a distinctively African education discourse. Central to the issue of philosophy in Africa is the question of relevance and usefulness. Africa, perhaps owing to its level of development at this point, wants philosophy to contribute towards the political, economic, ethical, and general upliftment of the people, which would make sense. In Africa, philosophy is extended to be pragmatic and to render service, right, as it should. It must contribute effectively towards the amelioration of the human condition, the lived and existing human condition. Wiredu, as quoted by Anyanwu in 1989, concludes, "We will only solve our problems if we see them as human problems arising out of a special situation." Thus, Anyanwu affirms that African philosophy invites people to take a stand on the issue of reality as experienced. This experience of an African reality gives rise to a sense of commonality in an enunciation of an indigenous African knowledge system, which finds expression in certain general themes in African philosophy. Over in the chat room, Lisa T says, African philosophy to me is centered around us Africans. What, who, where, about us, for us, by us. We rely too much on what Eurocentric we rely too much on Eurocentric philosophies, and I agree. Athrazer says curriculum, systems, teachers. That's what African philosophy is to him. Curriculum, systems, teachers. And that's our philosophy in the works that we're in the middle of doing right now. So the next section is the general themes in African philosophy. By the way, I'd like to thank you guys. I think there's about 5 of you listening, a few of you participating in the chat room. I appreciate you guys. Make sure to give me a thumbs up and a subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. And also, if you feel inclined to share the podcast with others around you, people you think would gain something from this kind of discussion. Again, I thank you. So we have this next section now called General Themes in African Philosophy. Despite the diversity and extraordinary dynamism of the African continent, as emphasized by Appiah, it is argued by many that there are commonalities that unite the African experience. In the words of Diop, there is a profound cultural unity still alive beneath the deceptive appearance of cultural heterogeneity present in Africa, which gives rise to the contents of an indigenous African knowledge system. What then has African philosophy to say about a distinctively African experience of life? Letsika in 2000 highlights the following commonalities in the African experience of life that are addressed as general themes in African philosophy: African communalism and the notion of Ubuntu. I have this paper on African communalism. I think that might be my next topic. So look out for my notification for the next episode. I'm probably going to talk about African communalism and what that looks like. According to Letseka, the importance of communality to traditional African life cannot be overemphasized. This is because community and belonging to a community of people constitute the very fabric of traditional African life. Unlike the Western liberal notion of the individual as some sort of entity that is capable of existing and flourishing on its own, unconnected to any community of other individuals, not bound by any biological relationships or socioeconomic, political, and cultural relationships, obligations, duties, responsibilities, and conventions that frame and define any community of individuals, the communal conception of the individual in most traditional African settings is described by Mbiti in 1970 in the following way. Whatever happens to the individual happens to the whole group. And whatever happens to the whole group happens to the individual. The individual can only say, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. And you see, that's what I mean. Like, in the work that we're doing, and when I say we, I mean like conscious, so-called conscious community, Pan-Africans, etc. Right? We gotta understand that we know that Africa is the end goal, but we cannot ignore the individuals in different locations. And we can't ignore those individuals who might decide that they're not trying to go back to the continent. So we need to create a power that even protects them, a power that has reach, that can even give them some protection, and frankly, gives them something that raises their esteem, their self-esteem. Talked about that a few weeks ago in an episode, right? We overlook self-esteem too often. This is why our kids tend to be so messed up, or other people in our age group when we were kids tend to go a different direction than we went. Like a lot of people don't realize like self-esteem is so important. Once you have a strong Africa, that raises the esteem of all Africans worldwide. So we got to be mindful that it's not just this one landmass that we're focused on, but we're focused on every individual who's connected to that landmass. Thus, Mbiti claims, is a cardinal point in the understanding of the African view of man. Commenting on traditional life in Kenya, Kenyatta echoes similar views. According to Gikuyu ways of thinking, nobody is an isolated individual, or rather, this uniqueness is a secondary fact about him. First and foremost, he is several people's relative and several people's contemporary. I like that. Menkidi concurs. A crucial distinction thus exists between the African view of man and the view of man found in Western thought. In the African view, it is the community which defines the person as a person, not some isolated static quality or rationality, will or memory. One is therefore a biological relative of a broad family, is linked to a broad network of other people through marriage, associates with others through community roles, duties, obligations, and responsibilities, and is several other people's contemporary or neighbor. In traditional African life, a person depends on others just as much as others depend on him or her. But Seka also observes that traditional African morality is known for its concern with human welfare, hence Ubuntu, which means humanness. Gayeki argues that if one were to look for a pervasive and fundamental concept in African socio-ethical thought generally, a concept that animates other intellectual activities and forms of behavior, including religious behavior, and provides continuity, resilience, nourishment, and meaning to life, that concept would most likely probably be humanism. for you guys in the chat room and guys who are listening in the comments section, I want you to talk about how you feel. Like, if you're not from the continent directly, do you think your culture, wherever you're from, mirrors what I've just described from the reading to the African culture? Is there this Ubuntu? Is there this sense of humanness? Is there this sense of, one person represents a community and is tied to a community? Is that the case where you're from? Had to get some water there. Humanism is used here to refer to a philosophy that sees human needs, interests, and dignity as of fundamental importance and concern. Letseka points out that the expression Umuntu, Gumuntu, Gabuntu captures the underlying principles of interdependence and humanism in African life. It's funny when I read these passages in these papers that cover like an African language. This is to show the piss poor state that we're in. I'm reading it like it's a foreign tongue, like as if I was reading French or Latin or something like that. That's where we are, and that's what we got to change too. We also got to focus on language. Whenever we do curricular type stuff, we got to focus on language, right? We got to become more immersed in dialect and language. It translates to a person depends on others just as much as others depend on him or her. It illuminates the communal embeddedness and connectedness of a person to other persons. It also highlights the importance attached to people and to human relationships. As Sindane in 94 suggests, Ubuntu inspires us to expose ourselves to others, to encounter the difference of their humanness so as to inform and enrich our own. In other words, to be human is to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others. The underlying concern of Ubuntu is with the welfare of others. In fact, Letseka argues that individuals who strive for and fully embrace the notion of Ubuntu as their goal are driven by a humanist concern for treating others with fairness. They are probably hoping that they, in turn, will also be treated with fairness should they find themselves in similar circumstances. Fairness and humanness are, according to Letseka, crucial to personal well-being. A fulfilled and flourishing life ought to be one in which persons are reasonably well-fed, well-clothed, and housed, in good health, loved, secure, and able to make a conscious effort to treat others with fairness and humanness because they, in turn, are treated that way. And that right there shows you really how different we are from these Eurasian types. Like, I was listening to an interview with one of these the alt-right types, Richard Sherman. I think it's Richard B. Sherman, to distinguish from the football player. And in this piece, and I've played this before on a previous episode, but Richard Sherman talks about he doesn't care. Like, white folks don't care about fairness. They just care about winning. But clearly, our original African selves, the African cares more about fairness and humanness, right? Because we believe in this kind of reciprocity, right? We hope that you would treat me, I would hope that you would treat me with fairness and humanness, just like I'm treating you with fairness and humanness. And if you pay attention to this idea of communalism, which is why I like the idea so much, is in a capitalist system, if you stay here in America, for example, in this capitalist system, this system doesn't give a damn if you're fed, doesn't give a damn if you're naked, doesn't give a damn if you're homeless, doesn't give a damn if you have failing health, if you're sick and dying, if you're unloved and insecure. It doesn't care. You know, because at the end of the day, it's about acquiring those resources and, you know, making money, right? But in Africa, and even I'll even say this too. I'm going to kind of answer a question I asked earlier. Like even in the Caribbean, we have a similar mindset to this. We're somewhere in between, but it's closer to this mindset. We care about people not being fed and clothed and housed and in poor health, and, you know, about, you know, we care about people with mental health issues and all that kind of stuff, you know. In the chat room, I see Lisa T says, it used to be when I was a kid, not anymore from what I've seen down there. Before that, she said, we dismiss it like we dismiss a lot of emotional stuff. Yeah, we don't consider self-esteem and a lot of emotional things too highly. And I think that's a part of being in the capitalist system as well, right? In a capitalist system, you ain't got time to stop and think about those things. At least that's how the system teaches you. You know, it teaches you like in this system, you could have a family member that dies, and the system doesn't really care. The system says people die all the time. You know, Arthur there says, I see it in my remembrance of old Jamaican culture, not at all in my experience of American culture. Yeah, Islanders still have it a little bit, like Lisa T says, and I am inclined to believe her a little bit, because the islands have always, at least since independence and stuff, have strived to be a bit more Americanized. I could definitely see where, you know, this sense of community and stuff is dwindling. I know where I'm from in the capital, it has dwindled for sure. If you go to an out, so I'm from a place with many islands. If you go to an out island, it's still a little bit more African in how I've described it in this reading, right? I think cities tend to do that to you too. Places that are developing. Arthur says reciprocity is evident in nature. Yes, it is. In these capitalist systems, they are rapacious consumers who externalize cost and impossibility. We realize that nothing is external. Yeah, that's Arthur as well. These commonalities in African experience, namely a sense of communality and Ubuntu or humanness, will indicate, as Tefo argues, that there is a way of thinking, of knowing, and of acting that is peculiar to the African. For Africans, what they know is inseparable from how they know it in the lived experience of the African culture. This sense of Africanness is, in other words, born out of a deep socio-ethical sense of cultural unity that provides the African identity with its distinctiveness. What this may mean for the nature and content of an African educational discourse is our concern in what follows. And I should point out too that this author and what he is describing could be referencing strongly really what it was like before colonialism in Africa, right? And so maybe in Africa now, you don't see as much of this, like I said about the Caribbean, etc. You don't see as much of this in the continent now as well, because the idea is that we got to go back, right? We have to go back and bring it forward. African philosophy and educational discourse. In the light of such a sense of Africanness, what then are the implications for the construction of an African discourse in education? What ought to be the purpose of education in an African context and within the framework of African philosophy? And how does traditional African educational practice seek to educate the child? Notwithstanding the diversity inherent in an African knowledge system, I have identified two general themes in African philosophy, namely African communalism and the notion of Ubuntu. These two themes can be said to be pervasive to the African philosophical thought in a socio-economical sense, in that they transcend the cultural, linguistic, and ethnic diversity of African peoples. In the light of this, it might be proposed that educating for communal life and Ubuntu would be crucial to indigenous African educational discourse. And this is why we do this research, to get these kind of ideas. So when you're building a curriculum now, you should really keep these two thoughts in mind, right? Hold on a second. Let me put my phone to charge so I can see the comments. All right, I'm back. So educating for life in the community would be rooted in, as M. Cabela and Luthuli note, a welfare concern where the basis of communalism is giving priority to the community and respect for the person. It also involves sharing with and helping persons. Educational discourse within this African frame of reference would help African people function in relation to one another in their communal tradition. Such a functioning would promote a collective effort directed ultimately at the good of the community. This collective effort, in turn, would be characterized by a spirit of Ubuntu, which sees human need, interest, and dignity as of fundamental importance and concern. For educational, am I in the right place? Yeah. For educational endeavor, this would mean that indigenous African educational discourse would be directed at fostering humane people endowed with moral norms and virtues such as kindness, generosity, compassion. These are things that are foreign in a capitalist system. Compassion, benevolence, courtesy, and respect and concern for others. In short, an African educational discourse would be fundamentally concerned with Ubuntu in the service of the community and personal well-being. And that's the thing I've been preaching about building a curriculum. The reason why you want to help and build this African-centered curriculum that I'm proposing, right? The reason why you want to help is because the curriculum that your children are following, right, is a curriculum that completely detaches them from their community and their African tradition. If blacks in the West, or let's say blacks in America specifically, right, in the US, if they had an education system that really merged them or got them immersed more in African tradition, African culture, language, etc., there would be no ADOS. There would be no FBA, right? Because the people would be too intelligent to separate themselves, and they'll be too invested to separate themselves from being African. You see, and so this is why you need to invest in an African-centered curriculum. You're not going to get it in the schools. And you need to be directed, our children need to be directed on really where to go for this knowledge. And so this curriculum is about really helping the child find the solutions to problems around them, like I've been talking about for a few weeks now. And not just the problems that are around them, but again, because Africa is the ultimate goal, we're trying to build a stronger Africa ultimately. A lot of the practice that you would get in fixing the problems around you, you could take that back to the continent and fix the problems there. I've talked about it a lot in the past few weeks, but Flint still doesn't have clean water. You would think the Africans there in Flint would come together and figure out a solution. They're waiting on the elected officials. That's the failing of not having an African-centered curriculum. African-centered curriculum, like the way Booker T. Washington designed it many years ago for the Tuskegee Institute, would have you learning and working on what you're learning at the same time, would have you fixing and building the actual buildings that you're learning in. So when a water crisis comes up, you would be fixing that, because guess where you are? You're right in the middle of it with this water that you can't really drink. In short, an African educational discourse would be fundamentally concerned with Ubuntu and the service of community and personal well-being. Letseka is of the opinion that such an educational concern can be promoted through a pragmatic approach in which youngsters learn and acquire such an educational concern by example. The condition for such a pragmatic approach would be that youngsters live in communities that fully embrace and value humanism, understood as Ubuntu. It is assumed that persons in such communities would strive to treat others with a sense of Ubuntu, which entails treating them with fairness. A reciprocal expectation that a reciprocal expectation would be that those who are treated with fairness would also return the favor and treat others with fairness. As a normative concept, fairness is taken to be a desirable virtue on account of its concern with humane relationships. Now, fairness, as described here, to me is a, how do I put this? To me, fairness is a concept that to me, fairness is something that's more so on paper. In reality of life, one person is going to give more than the other. But the thing about it is, I always tell people around me, you know, if me and another guy go and lift a refrigerator, I might lift more than he does, even though we're both lifting the refrigerator. I might be exerting more work. The idea is that keep it close. Don't have it where I'm down there lifting the whole fridge and you're just there, right? So keep it close. So that's the thing about fairness, and I think it's important for children to understand that concept of fairness, that fairness is not as cut and dry as it's often presented, right? That it's actually something that you have to monitor, and something that at the end of the day, you want to keep it close. What I do for you, you should do for me relatively close to what I did for you. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? What's your concept of fairness? Is it this what I just read, or is it closer to what I just tried to describe my idea of fairness is? The emphasis on communalism and Ubuntu in indigenous African thought and experience also requires education in the African context to pay attention to interpersonal and cooperative skills. In this regard, Letseka argues that certainly interpersonal skills have been shown to be an integral part of educating for Ubuntu and the promotion of communally accepted and desirable moral norms and virtues. The development of cooperative skills in younger people will therefore play a crucial role in promoting and sustaining the sort of communal interdependence and concern with the welfare of others that is encouraged by Ubuntu. This sort of interdependence highlights the fundamental principle governing traditional African life, namely that persons depend on others just as much as others depend on them. You know, if you have been paying attention to these recent episodes, going back to when I was reading about Booker T. Washington and the work that he did with the Tuskegee Institute, you'll remember that, if you hadn't heard about it before, you remember that Booker T had a system going where the students were actually building the buildings in which they were going to be educated. And not only that, the older students who had a little bit more experience in the subject areas were teaching the younger students. Like, imagine that for a second. That's essentially what I'm describing here in this recent part of the reading, right? They learned, and because they're ahead, they assist the teacher in teaching the younger kids coming up. It's a beautiful thing, you know. Indigenous education in the African context has sought to instill desirable attitudes, dispositions, skills, and habits in children by means of recounting the oral traditions of the community. In my last episode, I spoke a lot about the modes of African education, and one of the modes that was talked about considerably was the oral tradition. A great deal of philosophical and educational material is, as Okeke notes, embedded in the oral traditions and customs of the people. An important aspect of Indigenous African education discourse is, therefore, concerned with teaching children the oral tradition, as well as helping them to learn to use language creatively and effectively. According to Boateng and Fajana, such learning is in essence a central feature in the education of the African child, because it is through oral traditions that much of the history of the community, as well as its values and beliefs, is passed on from one generation to the next. Oral traditions therefore played an active part in the Africans' everyday life and were a vital educational force in supplying accounts of a group's origin and related precedents to present-day beliefs, actions, and codes of behavior. Allow me to pause here for a second. Well, actually, no, I'm just about at the conclusion. Yeah, so actually, let me just pause for station ID real quick, and then we'll be back to finish up.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
All right, and we're back, continuing the reading here. It's been going good so far. I know I've gotten some engagement in the chat room, which is a first, kind of, for me, so I appreciate that. An educated person, to continue, an educated person in an African context will, according to Fafunwa, therefore be an individual who is honest, respectable, skilled, cooperative, and conforms to the social order of the day. In this sense, Indigenous African educational discourse is characterized not only by its concern with the person, but also by its interweaving of social, economic, political, cultural, and educational threads together into a common tapestry. And as a result, Indigenous education in Africa is distinguished by the importance attached to its collective and social nature, as well as its intimate tie with social and communal life. Education, then, in the Indigenous African setting cannot, and indeed should not, be separated from life itself. It is a natural process by which the child gradually acquires skill, knowledge, and attitudes appropriate to life in his or her community. An education inspired by a spirit of Ubuntu and the service of community. I really like how the author tied that up right there. In conclusion, let me grab my phone to check comments. Next time I'll have all of this charged up so I wouldn't have to take these breaks. But in conclusion, the centuries-old subjugation of Africa to colonial exploitation, ranging from slavery to the creation of socioeconomic structures during the colonial era, which were singularly designed to achieve maximum extraction and exploitation of raw materials, wreaks serious damage that remains palpable years after the demise of colonial rule. This was accomplished, as Nkomo notes, by a whole range of arrangements, including educational philosophies, curricula, and practices whose context correspond with that of the respective colonial powers. And there it is, man. You know, your education, your children's education, they're educated to be exploited and oppressed. And your job is to change that. You know, as I'm thinking about Arthur Zura in the comments, a couple weeks ago, I did an episode talking about the profile of an Afrocentric teacher. And I think every adult should listen to that episode. And not just listen to it, but internalize what the profile of an Afrocentric teacher is, because we all are potentially teachers, right? We all have lived experiences. We can teach younger people what to avoid, what to cling to, and what to avoid. And so this is the thing that we have to understand as the adults in the room, that when you send your kid to like the public school system, as well-meaning as you might intend to be, understand that that public school system is not teaching them anything that relates to them. Right? You go to a math class, you learn about Pythagoras. You go to a history class, you're learning about Mao or Hitler or some shit. You know, every facet of education, you know, you're engaging with and learning about people who don't look like you. When they do talk about folks who look like you, it's very brief and it's in passing almost. Like, do they still teach about Jesse Owens in school? I haven't heard Jesse Owens mentioned in a number of years now. When I was a kid back home, I was reading about Jesse Owens. It was fascinating to read about, you know? So you have to understand that that's the importance of education also. As I also talked about in another previous episode. Check out my recent episodes and you'll see what I'm talking about. Education is where you get your leadership from. When we talk about not having great leaders or who's the leader, and this, that, and the other, it's because your education is supposed to promote patriotism within the learner, right? So if you have an African-centered education, it stands to reason that that African-centered education will create an African-centered individual, one with pride, high self-esteem, one who's patriotic to the continent, to the people that the continent produces, right? And so forth and so on. And so, you know, we have enough understanding of these things that we as a people should really be doing better at this point. If we had Garvey 100 years ago, be so on point that we still reference Garvey to this day, that when a lot of these African countries were getting independence, a lot of them used some concept of Garvey in the flag or in the constitution, right? Like, think about that. So it's time for us to really start making real effective change. We see the problem. I mentioned it earlier. The reason why we have the misleaders in America is because we don't have the proper education in America. And if you want to build a better African at home or abroad, it has to be a better education. When that occurs, you cannot come with no ADOS or FBA or whatever. You see? To continue, in order to address this state of affairs, Indigenous African educational discourses would have as their mandate the goal of recovering the humanist and ethical principles embodied in African philosophy, and more particularly in the notions of communality and Ubuntu. Such Indigenous African educational discourses would also, as Hoppers in 2000 points out, constitute an attempt to develop both a vision and a practice of education that goes beyond schooling, because it is about empowerment, laying the basis for African people to participate in mastering and directing the course of change and fulfilling the vision of learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together as equals with others. That's well said. Educational discourses of this kind view knowledge and minds not as commodities, not just human resources to be developed and exploited and then cast aside, but as treasures to be cultivated to improve the quality of life of both individuals and societies. In such an educational dispensation, educational endeavor is directed not at human resource development, but rather at the development of resourceful human beings in the service of their communities. I gotta say, this writer gets better as the paper goes on, right? African philosophy therefore provides a framework for the transformation of educational discourse in Africa, in that it respects diversity, acknowledges lived experience, and challenges the hegemony of Western Eurocentric forms of universal knowledge. As such, African philosophy contributes to the construction of empowering knowledge that will enable communities in Africa to participate in their own educational development. And that's the end of that paper. What do you guys think of this paper that looks at Indigenous African educational discourse and a philosophical reflection? Was it a good paper? Did you feel energized that, yeah, we gotta start getting back, we have to become more African-centered. We gotta start working on our education, and this, what we discussed here today, what we read today, this is a good basis to start off your curriculum building, right? Community and humanness. In the chat room, I see Lisa T is saying, which is why Umar is despicable to me. Parents like me were desperate for a Afrocentric education for our boys. Yeah, so that's the other problem with Umar too. Like, is Umar going to conceive the whole curriculum on his own, by now you'd think the brother would learn that, you cannot do this kind of work by yourself and on your own. You have to have transparency in curriculum creation, in the general creation of the school, etc. So yeah, I feel that frustration. I too am frustrated by Umar, but I am happy, I guess you could say, that he did purchase the school from what it looks like. And recently I saw him posting on social media that they were like doing work in the school. So, I am hoping for the best. I hope it does work out. I hope he really keeps the idea in mind of having a curriculum that can create the adult, right? That transforms the student to become the African adult who's prepared to fix problems in Africa. You see, that's the thing that we really got to get going. We got to get that education and to get the minds of these kids right, to know that the education is preparing them for the work that needs to be done in the future. Lisa says in the chat room, we do have to become more Afro-centered. If we continue the way we are, our people will be lost forever. Yeah, and the thing about that is, like, not only would we be lost, we would be the losers, right? Not just lost, but the losers of society. We will be trampled, and to be frank, it wouldn't even make sense for us to still exist at some point here, right? We'll just be the whipping boys for white society. Lisa says she wouldn't let her dog in that Umar's school now, much less a whole child. And I get that too, because the missteps that he made, just to get to this point, the arrogance and all that stuff that he displayed, like, what is he gonna do in a school with your children? It's possible they may come out more confused, but I'm willing to wait and see what he does, but I too have some apprehensions about it. But yeah, family, this was another episode of the Bitter Medicine podcast. I want to give a special thanks to Lisa and Arthur for coming through and participating, and this is kind of what I've been talking about for a while now. Like, come through, engage, we can have a conversation of sorts while discussing the topic of the episode. Also, leave your thumbs up. Also, by being in the chat room, for example, the time watched for this video should be pretty decent, and that helps with this YouTube stuff to be able to do more stuff with the channel. So it's a big help for me when you guys stick around, you watch for a while, you participate, etc. I want to thank you all for tuning in. While I'm at it, I want you guys to listen to the other shows on KWAZ Radio. That'll be the Pro Black Perspective with Oni Tase. That would be the Harsh Reality Podcast from the guys Al Miguel, D Web, and Reese. And also Reese has her own show on KWAZ Radio called The Queen's Council. She's also here on YouTube. Check out her show as well. And lastly, if you think you have a voice, you have opinions, you have strategies and thoughts that are of a Pan-African nature, and you feel like you have something you want to say to people or want to share it, you could join the podcast network, KWAZ Radio Podcast Network. You can start a show, and we'll also promote you the same way I promote everyone else, and they promote me as well. Okay, so until next time, Lisa says, I usually listen after. I set a reminder for this one. We'll try to be in the chat room more often. And I appreciate that, sister. And I ask for those of you listening to the playback to do the same. So until next time, this has been the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.